You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
The job of university president has never been a position for the faint of heart. In the United States now, presidents has declined to less than 5 years, and vice presidents of academic affairs, the provosts from which new presidents often come, have even shorter terms than presidents. And then the coronavirus arrived. Campuses closed, classes delivered online, most research carried out remotely where possible. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act provided $14 billion to higher education in the United States, the largest one-year infusion of federal support directly to colleges and universities since the Great Recession. Canada's federal government has been similarly forthcoming, with direct aid to individual students, colleges and universities, and research activities. But all of these efforts still leave it to colleges and universities to figure out how to operate and provide a safe environment for students, professors, and staff for the fall opening of a new academic year. And aid notwithstanding, most institutions, including some with endowments in the billions of dollars, have made or will soon make substantial cuts to operating budgets that many see as a prelude to the several years following the Great Recession, when state and provincial financial support was less forthcoming. These are then difficult times in which to serve as a university president. And presidents who have served both American and Canadian universities are somewhat out of the ordinary. Our guest today is one of those, but truth be told, Santa Ono is out of the ordinary in many respects. A Canadian born in Vancouver of Japanese parents, Dr. Ono is the son of a notable academic and research mathematician. He attended the University of Chicago for his undergraduate degree and McGill University for his doctorate in experimental medicine. He did postgraduate work at Harvard and then joined Johns Hopkins, University College London, and Emory medical faculties successively. He began his career as an administrator, as a department head at the University College London, then served first as vice provost for academic initiatives and deputy to the provost, and then as senior vice provost at Emory University. He was selected to be the University of Cincinnati's provost and then president before joining the University of British Columbia in 2016. Known for a trademark bow tie and his use of social media, President Ono plays the cello and sings on occasion, but not, alas, today. Welcome, Dr. Ono, to Innovators. In the midst of crises, a common refrain often voiced is, when will we get back to normal? Or when will things kind of be the way they once were? And this is more than nostalgia. Crises disrupt and take people out of the relative comfort of the familiar, but it allows people at the same time to feel as though there's time for them to recover the stability. So crises can be something that really disrupt. In the case of higher education, the crisis brought on by COVID-19 comes on the heels, historically speaking, of the Great Recession caused in large part by the credit crunch back in 2009. So it may be that some, in fact many, maybe even most of the people who are affected by the current crisis actually lived through the previous one and know that the one now seems to be a far greater magnitude of a kind we have not known. So it's understandable that students and their families, faculty, staff, alumni, and others with an attachment to higher education react to the current crisis by asking, when will things get back to normal? Will it be like the college and university I know? I guess some would say this crisis is very different. This seems to be quite different. And it might be such that institutions that can date their origins 1,000 years back, it may be that they will disappear from what we see now. Is that one of these moments? Is this one of those times when the change that's happening in higher education in Canada and the United States will be so profound that we may have a hard time recognizing it?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I wish I had a clear view in the crystal ball of the future. I can say this is not the first time where those sorts of questions have been posed. Certainly there were questions about that in 2008, 2009, when there was the emergence of things such as edX and Coursera, and a lot of people were viewing that was the moment of disruption and that everything would move online. And there was a number of efforts, as you know, in the for-profit sector to move in that direction, many of which actually failed and went belly up. So that's an example where we thought we were where we are today, and it didn't happen. There's a couple of things I'd say about now. I think it is a little bit different now than in 2008, 2009. I think that the quality of remote instruction, online delivery is much higher. There's an entire industry of professionals, instructional designers that can take content and bring it to life, even at a distance. So that field is much more mature, and I think that that will make the transition to more online or hybrid pedagogies more prone to success, if you will. So I think this is a different time, and I think that the predictions for the closure of many colleges, especially small liberal arts colleges, and other institutions that are under constraint right now because of enrollment, I think some of them will certainly close. We're seeing that across North America. They're closing, or there are predictions that maybe up to 1,000 colleges and universities will close because of the impact of COVID, because they have been just living on the margins, if you will.
Yes.
And so I think that there will be a disruption. And my friend and colleague Gordon Gee was quoted, I think, in the New York Times saying that he thinks this time is indeed different. And so I do expect that this is going to be a pivotal moment for post-secondary. That being said, I still believe that for the top 50 or so institutions, public and private, in North America, that there's a lot of appetite for the face-to-face instruction, for the campus experience. You know, although we've been trying over the past couple of decades to diversify our student body in terms of socioeconomic status and other aspects of privilege, to be frank, that many of the institutions, public and private, are still relatively privileged. Yeah. And to be frank, there's sufficient numbers of individuals that are able to pay and that want that experience, that rich experience of an on-campus terrestrial experience, that I don't think those 50 institutions will, have to move online. There are enough people that want to go to those institutions. I think that beyond that group, those institutions are most vulnerable to students increasingly going towards remote or online instruction. So hopefully I guess that's sort of my just guess as to what's going to happen. And you've probably read in Forbes that some people have felt that the 50 institutions that have big brand names, the flagship publics and the private elite privates, might be approached by very large corporations such as Amazon or Google. We are developing a stronger relationship with Amazon, as you know, here at UBC. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, because they're ever expanding, if they were to approach institutions such as UBC or an Ivy League and have conversations about content delivery through their cloud system or something like that. So it's hard to see whether it's going to go there, but those companies are constantly looking at ways to broaden their impact on various sectors.
You know, given what you said about the kind of consequences you envision, which mostly in your case was on the instructional side, teaching, learning sort of side. What will, of those 50, let's say those 50 do quite well, just as you suggested, the capacity for the rest of the system to respond to the need for students pursuing degrees and or certificates, how will that play out in your mind?
Well, I think you touch upon a very important need. many individuals, both north and south of the border, have lost their jobs. And I'm on a number of panels, both north and south of the border, to think about the need for reskilling and upskilling of those individuals, that many of whom are pretty young and are unemployed. I think that it's very likely that many of those institutions, the community colleges and the teaching universities, will be very involved in providing micro-credentials and certificates to upskill and reskill. I think that fewer of the research universities will be as involved. I hope that UBC will be involved, but I think that the different mission of those kinds of institutions, where the research universities are really focused on multi-year degrees with an experiential component, the professoriate in those institutions are really passionate and focused on that kind of a mission. And so I think there'll be less take-up in the research university as opposed to the community college or the technical school or the teaching university. I think that's a lot of those institutions will pick up that responsibility, I predict.
And if I'm correct, I think you spent your entire adult career in the kind of institutions you just described as among the 50. Let me, for our listeners, let me just cite where you've spent your life. You were at the University of Chicago, one of the great private universities. You were at McGill University to do doctoral work there. You were at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, University College London, Emory University, the University of Cincinnati, and the University of British Columbia now. All of these are research-intensive institutions. Virtually all are highly selective in their undergraduate admissions. All are home to medical schools that are usually affiliated with a healthcare system that includes one or more hospitals. Their annual budgets are fascinating. They range from $1.3 billion to $6.5 billion. Now, you've painted a picture that suggests those 50 probably will not have to undergo some profound change. But can those enterprises, can research universities, the way we've devised them in North America, can they sustain themselves given two considerations? Their cost and the prices they charge students and students' families. As you well know, they've risen faster than the cost of healthcare. And B, when externally supported research costs are in effect marked up by anywhere from 60 to 70% to cover indirect costs for conducting research and then charged to the sponsor on top of the direct costs. Can those institutions be sustained either on their own or by support that they receive from government, private philanthropy, commercial activities?
So those are very important questions. And I think that COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerability of those business models at the research universities. I don't know if you've read recently the situation at Johns Hopkins University, which in many ways is the most research-intensive university in the world. And it is one of the larger annual budgets that you just mentioned among those institutions. A lot of people don't know that, but it has, I think, $2 billion in research just in terms of federal contracted. And so there's a vulnerability there if a particular government administration decides to defund some of those major activities. They're very vulnerable there. Much of that budget is tied to indirect cost recovery, which is quite significant in the US. It's much less significant in Canada. But so that makes it much more vulnerable in the US than in Canada. I think that in many of the research-intensive universities, a lot of that research turnover is industrial research, contract research. And in a situation like COVID, where many of those companies, multinational companies, are laying off tens of thousands of people and curtailing their research, that will have a direct impact on the research universities. Many of the research universities are dependent upon anywhere from 15 to 35% of their tuition revenue coming from international students. Part of the vulnerability at these major research universities is if there are travel bans and those international students cannot actually matriculate on campus, that in some cases can be up to half of all tuition revenue. To answer your question, can these institutions sustain themselves, especially in moments such as this that are unprecedented? The answer is that you can see right now as we speak that those institutions are struggling. You would think these would be the most insulated the most financially stable, but in many ways, they're more vulnerable than a teaching university with a very robust domestic or regional mandate. Mm-hmm. And so I think that they will ultimately survive. All of these major research universities will survive. They're going to have to cut significantly. As you already see, there are furloughs, there are layoffs, there are even in some cases tenured research faculty that are being let go because of financial exigency. So there will be a period of pain, but these institutions are also institutions that have some of the largest endowment, that have very loyal alumni bases. So I don't think that will wither away, but they will take quite a hit.
I want to change direction a little bit in my next question or so. This is the second time in less than 2 decades university graduates are faced with dire prospects of employment. But in the wake of COVID-19, they not only have to contend with a paucity of jobs and levels of unemployment not seen since the Great Depression. For a start, the idea of work is something one leaves home and travels to and is gauged by millions of Canadians and Americans remaining in their residence, or virtually, no pun intended, anywhere and working remotely via a smartphone and an array of portable devices. But more about work is changing than when and where people learn. Work. The very nature of work itself has changed. And if you bear with me a minute, I'd like to explore that a little bit more. You remember Charles Handy, the Irish writer who was mostly known for his work on economics and management and the like. But way back in 1989, which seems like a lifetime, he wrote about a labor economy in which everyone works for everyone, and what we now refer to as the gig economy. And it's made up of persons who are independent contractors who negotiate short-term jobs, not long-term contracts of employment. They are graduates of American and Canadian universities ready for a world of work that, on the one hand, calls on marketing skills to find, apply, and be hired to perform tasks on a project that may only last 3 months. And on the other hand, are recent graduates prepared to work with frequently changing teams of peers from numerous countries all over the world, from different cultures, and bring a project to completion relying on a common language, various degrees of proficiency within that team. Is that something college and university graduates are ready for?
That's a great question, and I think that the landscape is changing rapidly, and it'll change even more rapidly post-COVID. You're already seeing it happening. I have the chance to interact with a number of different companies, Fortune 500 companies and smaller ones. Mm-hmm. And they are rethinking their approach to their different sectors. So you're right, things are going to change. And you can see in the tech sector, it's very common for employees to be engaged for what I would have thought would be unthinkable short periods of time, few months, 6 months, a year. And mm-hmm. If you look at the resumes of a lot of the young employees of these companies, it seems like they're changing jobs every year. And it seems like it would have been a red flag in our time, but it's really quite common now. Yeah. And so the question that you raised was whether universities are preparing them for that kind of eventuality. And I would say that it depends upon the institution, and it also depends upon the program within any given institution. Mm-hmm. At UBC, I can tell you that there are parts of the university where we understand that that's the case, that is their future, and we're preparing them for that kind of a future, where team-based interdisciplinary approaches to problem solving are, that there's a long history of that in certain parts of the institution. And there are other parts of the institution where it's just at the infancy of thinking about how to prepare their students and their future graduates for that kind of a world. So there's a lot more work that has to occur. It's a work in progress. And there are institutional differences. There are institutions that are considering themselves bastions of the liberal arts that haven't even started having this conversation. Exactly. The students demand it, but the faculty and the administration are wedded to the way things have always been.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that answers your question.
No, it
But
does. And I just want to follow up on one piece of it. The part that I think some have expressed reservations about is how does one participate in a gig economy? We're taught, for example, not to market ourselves, which usually we just sort our resume and say, look at my resume. But in the kind of world that Charles Handy talked about, it was a world in which people were going to be thrown together into work groups, in which the individuals may come from all over the world. There may not be a common language in which everybody has proficiency. And the question arises is how does someone ensure that they're going to be successful at that? And so I think what you said is a crucial point. A Carnegie Mellon University is very much attuned to the world of work. Other universities, even those with august names, are not so attuned to that, and in many ways rely on the students' ability to actually market themselves. But I think it's the question of whether we have a generation of students who, having seen what 2009 did to their families, now having seen what COVID is doing to entire households, whether they are prepared for the kinds of efforts they're going to have to make to work. And I think that what you suggested is that it will very much depend. Let me close with just one other question that comes to mind when you said that. You've now been president of two really great universities. Tell us the biggest difference between what it's like to be a president of a Canadian institution and being a president of an American institution.
I would say that it's hard for me to differentiate between the American and Canadian university because there's so much variability in the US and in Canada. I'm currently in British Columbia, as you know, and I was just on the phone with my colleagues in Eastern Province. I won't actually specify it because I don't want to get them into trouble, but I can tell you that I'm very grateful to be in British Columbia. There's robust support for post-secondary here. As you probably know, in some of the other provinces in Canada and many of the states in the US, there has been over quite some long period of time, progressive cuts to support in higher education. We've been relatively flat. We even actually increased somewhat during my time here in terms of the allocation, the grant, the provincial grant or the state grant, whatever you call it. And so, you know, it's really more regional differences than national differences. You know, we are fortunate that we have a premier and we have a government that is very supportive of post-secondary here. We find that there's great collaboration. So as we think about how to respond to the COVID impact, how we think about reopening our campus, which is very, very complicated. That it's not very prescriptive. It's really a partnership. And so I'm very grateful for the situation here. Other parts of Canada, other parts of the US and the world, the government and the university administrations are not always on the same page. And in a hyper intense situation such as this, where there's not a lot of time to iron out differences, it's quite stressful. So, you know, I would say that we're privy to a lot of survey data that looks at the confidence of different regions and different countries to post-secondary. I would say that right now, and this can change at any moment, right now I would say that confidence in post-secondary or in higher education is a little bit higher in Canada than in the US. And that varies from region to region, from province to province. But as a whole, I would say that if you look at the survey data that I'm privy to, that Canadians are more supportive of and respectful of the role of higher education in not only the economy, but also in the formation of the next generation of citizens. I think that there's more rhetoric, depending upon what state you're in the US, which is critical of universities, of the fact that they need to be revamped, or that what's happening at universities is esoteric and not relevant for the nation. I think there's a lot more of that kind of rhetoric in the US than in Canada.
I can only say that when I look at you and think about that lovely place you're in, I always remember that the license tags on British Columbia always were so modest, the most beautiful place in the world. So with that note, so thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for the good work you're doing at UBC.
Thank you very much. Very honored to be interviewed by you. All the best.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.